Chapter 2. The Clock Strikes 13. The striking of the grandfather clock became a familiar sound to Tom, especially in the silence of those nights when everyone else was asleep. He did not sleep. He would go to bed at the usual time and then lie awake, or half awake, for hour after hour. He had never suffered from sleeplessness before in his life, and wondered at it now. But a certain tightness and unease in his stomach should have given him an answer. Sometimes he would doze, and then, in his half-dreaming, he became two persons, and one of them would not go to sleep, but selfishly insisted on keeping the other awake, with a little muttering monologue on whipped cream and shrimp sauce and rum butter and real mayonnaise, and all the other rich variety of his diet nowadays. From that, Tom was positively relieved to wake again. Aunt Gwen's cooking was the cause of Tom's sleeplessness. That and the lack of exercise. Tom had to stay indoors and do crossword puzzles and jigsaw puzzles, and never even answered the door when the milkman came, in case he gave the poor man measles. The only exercise he took was in the kitchen when he was helping his aunt to cook those large, rich meals, larger and richer than Tom had ever known before. Tom had few ideas on the causes and cures of sleeplessness, and it never occurred to him to complain. At first, he tried to read himself to sleep with Aunt Gwen's schoolgirl stories. They didn't even bore him enough for that, but he persevered with them. Then Uncle Alan had found him still reading at 11:30 at night. There had been an outcry. After that, Tom was rationed to 10 minutes reading in bed, and he had to promise not to switch the bedroom light on again after it had been switched off and his aunt had bidden him good night. He did not regret the reading, but the dragging hours seemed even longer in the dark. One night he had been lying awake as usual, fretting against the dark and against the knowledge that his uncle and aunt would be sitting reading, talking, doing whatever they pleased by the excellent electric lights of the sitting room. Here he was, wide awake in the dark, with nothing to do. He had borne it for what seemed many nights, but suddenly, tonight, he could bear it no more. He sat up, threw his bedclothes back with a masterful gesture, and stepped out of bed, though as yet with no clear purpose. He felt his way over to the bedroom door, opened it quietly, and passed out into the tiny hall of the flat. Tom could hear the sound of the ordered speaking of Uncle Alan from behind the sitting room door. He would be reading aloud from his favourite, clever weekly newspaper. Aunt Gwen would be devotedly listening, or asleep. A moment's thought, and Tom had glided into the kitchen and thence into the larder. This would have been a routine move at home. He and Peter had often done it. In Aunt Gwen's larder, there were 2 cold pork chops, half a trifle, some bananas, some buns and cakes. Tom tried to persuade himself that he hesitated only because he didn't know which to choose, but he knew that he wasn't hungry. As a matter of form, he laid hold of a very plain stale bun. Then, A great weariness of all food came over him, and he put the bun down, leaving it to another day of existence. He had been moving all this time in perfect silence. He would have been ashamed for his skill in such an expedition to have done otherwise. But he had ill luck as he went out from the kitchen and the larder. He came face to face with his uncle coming from the sitting room. His uncle's exclamation of surprise and disapproval brought his aunt out after him. Tom knew that he was in the wrong, of course, but they need not have made such a fuss. Aunt Gwen was most upset because if Tom slipped into the larder at night, that meant he was hungry. She wasn't feeding him properly. He was suffering from night starvation. Uncle Alan, on the other hand, had not been unobservant of Tom at meal times, and he could not credit his being hungry. Besides, Tom had admitted he took nothing from the larder. Why had he been there then? Was it a blind? What was it? Tom never really convinced them of the simple truth, that a boy would naturally go into the larder, even if he were not hungry. Anyway, they pointed out, he was out of bed far too late. He was hustled back again, and his uncle stood over him to make a speech.
Tom, there must be no more of this. You are not to put the light on again once it has been put out, nor equally are you to get out of bed. You must see the reasonableness.
Not even to get up in the morning? Tom interrupted.
Of course that's different. Don't be silly, Tom. But you are not to get up otherwise. The reason is...
Can't I get up, even if I need to? Badly.
Of course you must go to the lavatory if you need to, but you will go straight back to bed afterwards. You go to bed at 9 in the evening and get up at 7 in the morning. That is 10 hours. You need those 10 hours sleep because...
But Uncle Alan, I don't sleep.
Will you be quiet, Tom?
Shouted his uncle, suddenly losing his temper.
I'm trying to reason with you. Now, where was I?
10 hours sleep, said Tom subduedly.
Yes, a child of your age needs 10 hours of sleep. You must realise that, Tom. For that reason, you must be in bed for 10 hours, as I have said. I am making clear to you, Tom, that Gwen and I wish you, entirely for your own good, to be in bed and, if possible, asleep for 10 hours, as near as may be, from 9 o'clock at night. You understand, Tom?
Yes.
Now, I want you to promise to observe our wishes. Will you promise, Tom?
Why could a boy never refuse to promise these large demands?
I suppose so, said Tom. Yes.
There, said Aunt Gwen. And Uncle Alan said,
Good. I knew I could reason with you.
But, all the same, I don't sleep, Uncle Alan said sharply.
All children sleep.
And Aunt Gwen added more gently, It's just your imagination, Tom. Poor Tom had no answer except contradiction, and he felt that would be unwise. They left him. That meant that the hall light of the flat had been switched off for the night. Slow silence, and then the grandfather clock struck for 12. By midnight, his aunt and uncle were always in bed, and asleep too, usually. Only Tom lay still open-eyed and sullen, imprisoned in wakefulness. And at last, 1. The clock struck at the present hour, but, as if to show its independence of mind, went on striking. 2. For once, Tom was not amused by its striking the wrong hour. 3. 4. It's 1 o'clock, Tom whispered angrily over the edge of his bedclothes. Why don't you strike 1 o'clock then, as clocks would do at home? Instead, 5. 6. Even in his irritation, Tom could not stop counting. It had become a habit with him at night. 7. 8. After all, the clock was the only thing that would speak to him at all in these hours of darkness. 9. 10. You are going it, thought Tom, but yawning in the midst of his unwilling admiration. Yet, it hadn't finished yet. 11. 12. Fancy striking midnight twice in one night, jeered Tom sleepily. 13, proclaimed the clock, and then stopped striking. 13! Tom's mind gave a jerk. Had it really struck 13? Even mad old clocks never struck that. He must have imagined it. Had he not been falling asleep or already sleeping? But no, awake or dozing. He had counted up to 13. He was sure of it. He was uneasy in the knowledge that this happening made some difference to him. He could feel that in his bones. The stillness had become an expectant one. The house seemed to hold its breath. The darkness pressed up to him, pressing him with a question. Come on, Tom. The clock has struck 13. What are you going to do about it? Nothing, said Tom aloud. And then, as an afterthought, don't be silly. What could he do anyway? He had to stay in bed, sleeping, or trying to sleep, for the 10 whole hours, as near as might be, from 9 o'clock at night to 7 o'clock the next morning. That was what he had promised when his uncle had reasoned with him. Uncle Alan had been so sure of his reasoning, and yet Tom now began to feel that there had been some flaw in it. Uncle Alan, without discussing the idea, had taken for granted that there were 24 hours in a day, twice 12 hours. But suppose, instead, there were twice 13. Then, from 9 at night to 7 in the morning, with the 13th hour somewhere between, was more than 10 hours. It was 11. He could be in bed for 10 hours and still have an hour to spare. An hour of freedom. But steady, steady. This was ridiculous. There simply were not 13 hours in a half day. Everyone knew that. But why had the clock said there were then? You couldn't get around that. Yes, But everyone knew the grandfather clock struck the hours at the wrong times of day. 1 o'clock when it was really 5, and so on. Admittedly, argued the other Tom, the one that would never let Sleepy Tom go to sleep. Admittedly, the clock struck the hours at the wrong time. But, all the same, they were hours. Real hours. Hours that really existed. Now the clock had struck 13, affirming that, for this once at least, there was an extra 13th hour.
But it just can't be true,
said Tom aloud. The house, which appeared to have been following the argument, sighed impatiently. At least, I think it isn't true. And anyway, it's muddling.
Meanwhile, you're missing your chance, whispered the house.
I can't honourably take it, said Tom, because I don't believe the grandfather clock was telling the truth when it struck 13.
Oh,
said the house coldly. So it's a liar, is it? Tom sat up in bed, a little angry in his turn.
Now, he said, I'm going to prove this one way or the other. I'm going to see what the clock fingers say. I'm going down to the hall.